everyone, welcome to this week's episode of Korea This Week, and I'm your host, Sang Kim, and today we have Troy Stangarone, who is KEI's Canadian Director for Congressional Affairs and Trade. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me today.
Great. I hope everyone had a great Memorial Day weekend. We had a 3-day weekend, which was great, but never long enough.
Yeah, today's not Monday. What are we doing?
So let's get started. It seems like President Trump had a very busy weekend. He was just in Tokyo for a state visit with Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, and he had a joint press conference, which North Korea obviously came up. So he mentioned that Chairman Kim Jong-un is a very smart man. He understands very well that he won't get to economic development with nuclear weapons. And in addition to that, he tweeted on Saturday, I believe, that he's not bothered by North Korea's testing some small weapons, and he's confident that Chairman Kim will keep his promise. So that's President Trump.
Yeah.
Then yesterday we heard from U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton that he believes there's no doubt that North Korea violated the UN security sanctions with their he called it a ballistic missile launch earlier this month. So I have two questions for you, Troy. One, with two different message from President and the National Security Advisor, where is U.S. policy towards North Korea going?
So this was actually somewhat of an awkward trip. Mm-hmm. Not only did President Trump basically contradict his own national security advisor about the nature of the test, but he also contradicted his host, Prime Minister Abe, who had said that these were also tests that violated the UN Security Council resolutions. So you have this awkwardness. In terms of where U.S. policy is going, ultimately this will depend on what President Trump would like. He clearly will get advice and from both Secretary Pompeo, John Bolton, his national security advisor. But even if, and it's kind of clear that Bolton is taking a harder line on North Korea than the president is, and President Trump has even said, I'm the one who has to rein Bolton in. So, I think right now we're still on the path for dialogue. That would seem to be the president's preferred course of action. We haven't really seen, the Trump administration try to ratchet up the sanctions either. Right. So we're sort of in this path waiting for the North Koreans to kind of come back to discussion about their program and try and really sort of work this through. Now, could that change or will that change? Yes, but I think right now the president himself is still in that lane. Right.
So it seems like President Trump is being very, very patient, and he's toning down his rhetoric towards North Korea. But how long would this continue? I mean, how long can he be patient with North Korea in terms of, what if North Korea does another launch or another test?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple different levels to this question. If North Korea doesn't engage in, say, a clear intermediate range ballistic missile test or a long range ballistic missile test or another nuclear test, I think President Trump can probably allow this to go on for an indefinite period of time. If they do something provocative, like shoot a missile over Japan, as they've done in the past, or do longer range tests, these kinds of things will ultimately make this difficult. And it'll be something to where, President Trump will really start feeling pressure to have to do something. That being said, Kim Jong-un said earlier this year that basically the United States had until the end of this year to take and change its position to try and come back to talks on a more, what they felt was something more amenable to their position. So, there is this sort of deadline from Kim Jong-un. Now, it's not clear that necessarily Kim Jong-un would actually take provocative actions if President Trump doesn't, come back to talks on his terms by that point. So there's a little bit of vagary here, and Kim Jong-un's left him some ability to get out of this, sort of like when he threatened to attack Guam, the way he phrased it. But, there is going to be a point in time to where it's going to be clear that these talks may not be going anywhere, whether that's the end of this year or something else. In the absence of, the North Koreans being willing to meet with Steve Biegun, our special representative, which they're not at this point. I think, we're kind of at a stalemate. In essence, both parties are practicing their own version of strategic patience at the moment, as much as, neither might want to admit that.
Right. So at the moment, it seems like U.S. North Korea talks is not going anywhere, and the same for the Korean dialogue as well. So do we know any updates from that front?
So, there are bits and pieces here. The liaison office that the North and South have set up, there haven't been meetings in at least the last 2 months or so. So that channel has kind of died off. There is an effort on the South Korean side to try and have the businessmen who ran the companies in Kaesong go up to inspect their factories. There had been concern about that in the past, but now there's also reporting that the North Koreans may have taken equipment from the facilities there to use in other factories in North Korea. So there might actually be a very strong reason at this point to try and visit, to at least see, is the equipment there? What condition is it in? That doesn't mean that, we should expect Kaesong to reopen anytime soon, right, but to at least know, are the North Koreans essentially expropriating South Korean property? But at the moment, Prime Minister Abe himself had even taken an offer to meet with Kim Jong-un, and the North Koreans haven't really responded. So it seems like everything is pretty much at a stalemate at this point.
Right. We talked about the Kaesong businessmen having permission to go up to North, but I don't think we've heard anything from North Korea's response. And the thing about the North Koreans potentially taking equipment, I think that came out last week after our episode. So that's a new development, but we still don't have any updates on that.
Yeah.
So that's on the North Korea front. I want to change gear a little bit and talk about the U.S. and China trade tension and how that affects South Korea. So last week there's a huge article about Huawei. So the U.S. President Trump signed an executive order that banned the use of Huawei equipment in the U.S. telecom network, especially on the national security ground. And it's allegedly, the U.S. government allegedly have been lobbying South Korean government as well as other allies to not use Huawei. So to get started, first, why is Huawei targeted out of other companies?
So we're in the point, South Korea was the first country to commercially deploy 5G cellular networks. Limited to just parts of Seoul, basically at this point, but still one of the first. The United States was second. But a lot of the equipment, the exchanges, and the other parts that carry the traffic through those networks is made by Huawei. The U.S. basically has specific concerns with Huawei. One, under Chinese law, in essence, any technology company is required to assist the government with tracking information or shutting the network down if need be. And so the question is, how would equipment made by a Chinese company work in this type of system? So one, you have a question of, will the Chinese be able to use this equipment to spy on communications? What a lot of U.S. allies, not a lot perhaps, but the British specifically, the Germans, some others feel like this is a challenge that can be managed. Putting the equipment in sort of lower priority areas, having equipment by Ericsson, Nokia, or Samsung used in areas that are more sensitive. But, at the end of the day, the British government also set up a lab to test the equipment. And while Huawei does have a good reputation for making good equipment, one of the things that the British government has noted in past evaluations of equipment is that, one, the software tends to be not very good. So even if the Chinese government isn't trying to create secret backdoors, Huawei's software is potentially vulnerable, and they tend to not be very responsive in terms of when flaws have been found and updating them. So you have this problem. Now, in terms of intercepting traffic, most of the information that is intercepted, or potentially could be intercepted, is already vulnerable. So like banking communications and things. You have other communications the banking would be encrypted, which, because it's encrypted, it's not necessarily as vulnerable, even if it's going over Huawei's network. But the real concern, other than perhaps intercepts, is whether in a conflict, basically the equipment could be used to shut down communications networks that the United States and its allies are using. And so you do have this question of whether they could intercept military communications or other things, but it really comes down to, will they have control of the equipment to be able to shut it down in a conflict? And so this is kind of why the U.S. has been expressing to its allies a lot of concerns about equipment from Huawei.
Right. So you mentioned South Korea a little bit as the first country to leave the 5G. So how would South Korean companies be affected by this Huawei sanction?
Yeah. So the Huawei equipment tends to be cheaper than equipment from Samsung, Nokia, and Ericsson. Some of this is because of the pricing plans that Huawei puts together. Some of this is probably likely due to Chinese government subsidies. But in essence, what you have now is some of the companies, specifically like LG Plus, had used Huawei equipment in their 4G development and wanted to use it in 5G. And LG has actually already started implementing some of the equipment or, using it. So you have South Korean companies that, were looking to use this and to do it, to deploy the 5G networks quickly. But so now the question becomes, what will they be able to use? And, how will that then start impacting, their dealings with the United States?
Right. So, obviously this is a huge deal in terms of technology, and 5G is supposed to be the next big thing, right? It's supposed to change the landscape of technology and how things are done in terms of network. But do you see any other areas where the tension between the U.S. and China could affect South Korea?
So, right now, setting aside this executive order on Huawei, there's sort of, I think, two trends that are developing. One is this broader trade conflict between the United States and China, to where, tariffs have been placed on, most of China's exports to the United States. If you look, though, at how that's affecting the Chinese economy, which is South Korea's largest trading partner, through the first few months of this year, South Korean exports to China are down 14.1%. So you're seeing, even if it's not necessarily specifically goods that are being shipped as parts to China to be assembled and then shipped to the United States, you're seeing a broader slowing in China, which is then slowing South Korean exports. So South Korea is being hit, sort of indirectly in this. But moving beyond sort of that, sort of maybe what one might hope would be short-term economic cost, you are seeing this effort to sort of create a bifurcation on technology between essentially China and the United States. China has its Great Firewall, which a lot of people didn't think would be successful, but as China sort of walled itself off, but then tried to expand beyond, now you're seeing pushback on the U.S. side. And so there is going, some have started referring to it as, the digital Iron Curtain or something of that nature. But we are potentially moving in this direction. And that means that, technology companies and service companies in South Korea might have to start making decisions about what software they use, what type of equipment they use, and how much they're able to do business in the United States and China. So, a lot of this will depend on how some things play out over the next few months and maybe up, to be honest, through President Trump's reelection. But, we are starting to see a broader divergence in the global trading system now.
Right. And this is probably only the beginning, right? And there could be a lot more conflicts and disagreements, especially in the technology realm. So with that, that's all the news for this week. And I do want to highlight that KEI is hosting an event this Thursday. It's a documentary viewing of the documentary called The Children Gone to Poland. So it's about 1,500 North Korean orphans who were sent to Poland during Korean War. And the director of the film is Chu Sang-mi, who you might recognize as actually an actress in South Korea. She turned into a director, and she's been working on this film for a really long time. So we'll have the viewing and also the discussion with the director here at KEI on Thursday, 6 p.m. We're actually going to start promptly at 6. So if you're interested in coming, please feel free to RSVP on our website.
But it's also a big week for Korean film in general. Yes. The Cannes Film Festival, one of the films winning the Palme d'Or. I forget the name of the film, but what's the Korean film again?
Parasite.
Okay. Yeah.
Parasite by director Bong Joon-ho, who did the Snowpiercer and also Okja as well.
So this is a really big honor for South Korean film.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, with that, that is it for this week. Troy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you so much for watching, and we'll be back next Monday at 2 p.m. Bye.